todo, ella es una psicoanalista de niños, adolescentes y adultos. Inició su formación estudiando en la Universidad de California en Berkeley, que ahí estudió literatura, pero después estudió psicología en la University College of London. Se formó como psicoanalista infantil con Anna Freud en Londres y continuó su formación de adultos en la New York Freudian Society, asociada a la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad de Michigan. Siempre he trabajado con familias, niños, adolescentes y adultos. En la actualidad, la doctora Novi, que es conocida como una psicoanalista, tiene trabajado con evidentemente tenemos un problema de sonido. Bueno, yo les continúo mientras contando que la doctora Novi es entonces reconocida por su trayectoria internacionalmente, por su comprensión en el trabajo psicoanalítico de niños y adolescentes en el contexto actual. Ha trabajado con niños y con sus familias en técnicas de crianza reflexiva y positiva durante más de 4 décadas. Ella fundó hace más de 25 años una escuela que se basa también enseña en universidades y en centros de capacitación por todo el mundo y imparte conferencias especialistas en la materia, así como al público en general y a padres de familia también. Por último, queríamos mencionarles que actualmente la doctora Claudia Novi es candidata a la vicepresidencia de la mesa directiva de la Internacional de la Asociación Psicoanalítica. Por favor, démosle la bienvenida.
Vamos a esperar que le puedan ayudar a la doctora con el traductor, con el aparato para traducción, para que ella pueda escuchar la intervención del público. Y le queremos agradecer de manera muy especial la generosidad de la doctora Novik, que se encuentra hoy con nosotros. Está un poco mal de su garganta y es posible que esté tosiendo o que se tome un poco de tiempo para intervenir. Nos hizo pues el gran favor de poder estar aquí sintiéndose un poquito indispuesta, pero no se preocupen, ella está bien, simplemente van a ver que puede ser que tosa, es parte de la pequeña... Exacto, está mucho, dice que suena mucho peor de lo que está, ¿ok? Entonces, bueno, no hay más que hacer que introducirles a la doctora Novi.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to see so many people. Is this on? No? Yes. I'll do it this way. Is this better? Can you hear me? We'll get it organized. We'll manage. One, two, three. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's very exciting to be at Ampiep and to see so many people interested in talking about, now I can hear that you can hear me. Interested in talking about adolescence. The way we thought, that's very loud. Is it okay? This is the trouble with the technology. I could stand up and shout. The way we thought that we would organize this afternoon's discussion is, instead of me giving a lecture and you sitting there, we want to generate a dialogue because I think we all work with children and adolescents in different ways. And what is useful, I think, is to share our experience because it's not always easy interacting with adolescents. I read recently something very funny, that archaeologists found clay tablets from the ancient city of Ur in Babylon from 4,000 years ago. And when they deciphered the cuneiform script that was written on the tablets, it was a commentary saying that if the young people of today do not change, the world as we know it will be destroyed. So 4,000 years ago, people were experiencing adolescence as disruptors of the status quo, as a force in society that challenged what the adults were talking about. I'm not sure things have changed all that much, but perhaps this group of adults would not feel so negative about that. I think most of us who work with adolescents also enjoy the creativity, the energy, the enthusiasm, the innovation, and the sheer fun of interacting with young people who have their lives ahead of them. It's very exciting to think about the future and think about how we can most effectively and constructively help adolescents grow into a very good, strong future. So one of the curiosities that I had about this meeting was to know how many of you are therapists who work with adolescents? A lot. Are there people here who are counselors? Mm-hmm. Are there teachers here? Well, there's some overlap among these groups. And I think that that's important too. So I want to make sure that we manage to include the experience from all of these perspectives, because there's a lot of overlap, but there are also things we can learn from each other in these different groups that are experience that the other groups may not have. So we've talked about adolescence as a potentially disruptive force, but also as a creative force. And since we here are psychoanalysts, what I want to do is try to think together about what the interaction is between what is going on internally for adolescents in their development and in their personalities and what is going on externally. It used to be a long time ago, not even so long ago, that nature and nurture were considered opposites. They were like two different categories, mutually exclusive. One of the things that's most interesting about modern science and that has had a big impact on psychoanalysis is that we now understand that there's no such thing as nature or nurture, that there is a constant interaction, not just a simple interaction, but a complex interaction, so that what happens to somebody coming from the outside, from the environment, and the environment includes their relationships with the important people in their lives, not only affects what they brought to it from nature, but transforms that. The name for that interactive process, that complex interactive process, is epigenesis. And epigenesis has become a very important organizing principle, not just in psychoanalysis, but in all the natural sciences. And I hope that as we talk today about adolescence, we'll be able to think about how to tease out the different influences in terms of what adolescents are bringing to their lives and interactions. So if we think that one of the basic organizing principles of epigenesis is transformation, that's the first main point I want to convey today. And this has to do with the idea of what psychoanalysts have generally thought about as the goal of the developmental phase of adolescence. What is adolescence about? What is it for? Now, in Anglo-American culture, there has always been a very clear explication of what adolescence is for. It's always been described as being about separation. But in Anglo-American culture, that is very culturally consistent with the socio-cultural pressure to physically separate from one's family. Go west, young man, is what adolescents in the United States were told in the 19th century. And even in England in the 17th and 18th century, the idea was that people left their family of origin and struck out into new territory. Psychoanalysis actually was very influenced by this tradition. And so one of the things that might be interesting for us to talk about today is the kind of tension that exists between classical psychoanalytic theoretical descriptions of adolescent development and cultural differences, because in Mediterranean cultures and Latin cultures, the goal of late adolescent and young adult development is not to physically separate from one's family. In Italy, there is the phenomenon of the familia lunga, and the other day someone told me the Spanish name and I forget it. Familia muégano. Okay. So there's one point of contrast that we can think about. But one of the hallmarks of psychoanalytic thinking is that we really try to think about the experience inside the person, in the mind, in the thoughts and feelings, in the personality. So one of the other ways that psychoanalysis has thought about the developmental goals for adolescence is not physical separation, but internal separateness. So there's another distinction that I would like you to think about, the difference between separateness and separation. Separateness is a given of the human existence. When a baby is born, we don't really know that person. The baby is a stranger. We may think we know that baby. We may imagine who that baby is, but we don't really know. We have to get to know that baby, just as that baby has to get to know us. But the baby is a separate person from the beginning. So separateness is a strand that goes throughout development, long before we think in terms of separation. Little babies can't separate from their parents. They wouldn't survive, separating physically. But separating psychologically is part of a long process of development that happens from the beginning and adds incrementally throughout the whole life cycle. So there's another distinction that we'll want to include in our discussion, is the question of the sense of a subjective self, the sense of who am I? What kind of person am I? And we could talk about the contributions to that sense of self, that identity, that happen at every stage of development throughout childhood. But today, since we're talking about adolescence, we're talking about identity formation in adolescence. And we should think about the ingredients that go into that. I'm going to have a sip of tea. What contributes to identity formation in adolescence? We can also make a distinction between pathological identity formation and healthy identity formation. my husband, Jack Novick, who is also a psychoanalyst and wishes he could be here today, but he's not, we have written a great deal about different models of thinking about development. And one of the models we've been working on most recently is something we call the two systems model. And in that model, we look at two potential responses to the challenges of life throughout development. You can respond in an open system way, which we characterize as a realistic relationship to oneself and others and to the world, or a closed system way, which can most easily be characterized in terms of magical thinking. In other words, not related to reality, but more having to do with experiences that render the individual helpless, and the individual desperately seeks some magical remedy, some solution that will allow them to feel intact as a person. In other words, to protect their identity. We all have to protect ourselves. And if we have an experience of helplessness, which is the psychoanalytic definition of trauma, when the ego is rendered helpless, when the person feels overwhelmed and cannot access their capacities to grapple with the situation, when we're really helpless, we fall back on magical thinking. And that strand of magical thinking, what we call closed system functioning, pervades our lives. It's not just that that's pathological and open system functioning is healthy, because we all have the potential for closed system functioning when we feel desperate enough. Think about what happens when you get ill and you feel helpless. You may get superstitious. If it's a serious illness, you may, go and try esoteric remedies. We all reach for magic when we are threatened. So think about the predicament of adolescents, young adolescents whose bodies are changing so rapidly that they can easily feel helpless about it. Okay. And should I slow down? We have plenty of time, so we can pause. We're okay? Now, what was I saying? I was talking about the experience of helplessness and the way in which an adolescent, and think about puberty, we've all been through it. Sometimes for a pubertal kid, they don't know what their body's going to feel like from one day to the next. They wake up in the morning and they've grown another inch, or they've developed in a new way, or suddenly there's hair where there was no hair before. That can really throw somebody. Rapid change really needs to be well supported to be tolerated. Otherwise, it can render somebody helpless. And then they may have recourse to magical solutions. So one of the things that I think would be useful for us to talk about is the way in which puberty, so let's divide it into early adolescence, middle adolescence, and late adolescence, and think about what developmental tasks are different in those different subphases and what developmental tasks are the same. So we've already established the idea that identity formation is an ongoing task, not just in adolescence, but throughout life. But it's especially rapid and massive in adolescence. It's the coalescence of the adult personality that is going to take place through adolescence. But there are some things that are different at the different subphases of adolescence that have to do with ingredients of identity. For instance, if we look at the developmental line of sexuality, early adolescents have to come to terms with the fact that they are sexual beings. middle adolescents have to come to terms with what kind of sexual being am I? Masculine, feminine, gender fluid, the whole spectrum. And later adolescence, it's really only in later adolescence that we get the coalescence of what do I want to do with this gendered body? Whom do I want to interact with my gendered body? In other words, the object choice, the choice of partner. So if we look at the developmental line of sexuality in adolescence, we can see that there are tasks in the subphases. But we can also see that the overarching way we could define all of those tasks is in terms of transforming the identity. So Jack and I do not think about adolescence as having to be the goal of adolescence is separation. We really think of it in terms of transformation as the goal of this phase of development. How does the adolescent successfully transform his relationship to himself, to the important people in his life, adults and peers, and his relationship to reality? Psychoanalysts talk about two organizing principles of functioning. We talk about the pleasure principle, which posits that given a choice, we would opt for stuff that feels good instead of stuff that doesn't. The notion of the pleasure-unpleasure experience and what we might call the pleasure economy. How does one organize one's life to maximize pleasure and minimize unpleasure? And the other principle is the reality principle. How do we interact with the world in a realistic way and come to terms with that? If people do not come to terms with that and continue to function with magical thinking instead of realistic thinking, we could characterize that way of thinking as omnipotent. You know, if a 4-year-old says, "I'm Superman," we say, yes, we know you would love to be Superman, but you're not really Superman. But if that 4-year-old cannot learn that distinction and wants to jump off the roof thinking he can really do it, that is functioning in an omnipotent way. That is denying reality. All of us who work with adolescents know that there is an extraordinarily intense tension, if not conflict, for adolescents between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. They are experiencing new sources of pleasure in their bodies, in their relationships, and in their capacity to have an impact on the world. Because one of the main differences between adolescence and earlier stages of development has to do with reality. Adolescents can actually put wishes into action. There aren't too many 7-year-olds who can put their wishes into action. You know, you can't do much when you're a little kid. But once you're an adolescent, you can have sex. You can hurt somebody or kill somebody. You can create something lasting. You can learn a body of knowledge that has real impact in the world. And that's recognized in most of the legal codes and most of the world's great religions, because the coming of age, when we hold people legally responsible for their actions in most societies and in most religions where we consider that the adolescent is joining the community of adults, is sometime right after puberty, when they are capable of being held responsible for their actions. So on the one hand, how fabulous for adolescents. I can really do stuff. I can really have an impact. On the other hand, how terrifying. If you have an impulse, if you get really angry and you want to bash somebody, it's quite scary to think that you could actually hurt somebody. You know, 7-year-olds can't really hurt anybody badly. Adolescents can. So one of the other things that we have to think about is how can adolescents develop realistic controls and gradually set aside omnipotent solutions and omnipotent thinking that is based only on the pleasure principle and doesn't include reality. So maybe we should think about how conflict between these two ways of relating to the world manifests at this age group. And I'm going to drink a couple of sips of tea while somebody among you responds to what I've talked about already with some comments or some questions, and see if we can generate some dialogue on the basis of your experience and my experience. So take a turn for a minute.
No sé si alguien tiene el micrófono por ahí. Es decir, para iniciar el diálogo de acuerdo a las experiencias de las mismas.
Si hablas en el despacio, puedo entender. No hablo mucho, pero entiendo.
Igual se oye porque está chiquito, ¿no? Igual se está
It's all right. I can also keep going, but it would be nice if you want to tell us whether any of these ideas make sense to you.
Primero que nada, muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. Lo que estaba yo pensando es que, aunque son conceptos que conocemos ya, me parece que los ha puesto en una forma que nos permite fácilmente distinguir cosas que en las que a lo mejor no habíamos puesto tanta atención. Sobre todo el asunto de la transformación en soluciones realistas y en soluciones mágicas que pueden darse. Le quería preguntar si en su trabajo también ha tomado en cuenta la parte física de enfermedades que pueden afectar a los muchachos y que a veces no se sabe qué tanto pueda ser una cuestión física o si es una cuestión puramente psicológica. If you in neurological terms, for instance.
I think that that's an important observation, that we can imagine that somebody coming to terms with a rapidly changing body feels much more uncertain about how to interpret the sensations that are coming, how to assign meaning. So I think we can think of that from a number of points of view. We can think of it from the point of view of the psychosomatic illnesses. We can think of it from the point of view of actual physical sensations that have an impact. If we think, for instance, of young women starting to menstruate, and the way in which for many young women there's discomfort associated with that, there's uncertainty about the meaning of the physical manifestations. There's also the way in which children are used to having their parents make sense of their physical manifestations. You know, if a 10-year-old says, "Mommy, I have a stomachache, I don't want to go to school," Mommy figures out how to make the judgment about this. not the child. But an adolescent, we want them, as part of their development, to internalize the parenting functions. And that includes physical and emotional self-care. How do you learn to interpret your own physical signals as well as your own emotional signals when your body is changing rapidly and your brain is changing rapidly? So one of the things the new neurological information is helping us understand much more about is the brain changes that happen in adolescence up through the age of 26, and the interaction of those brain changes with hormone metabolism. So we have a period of development where psychophysiological interaction is very powerful. And so I think it's as confusing for adults as it is for children or for adolescents sometimes to know how to make sense of it. And in my experience with adolescent patients, it's a process of figuring it out together. And usually with adolescent patients, you know, if they come in, if you can get them to come in even if they have a stomach ache or a headache, then you can work with them to think about what other times have they felt like this, and what did it mean then, and what do they think about it, and have them associate to it. With adolescents who are not in treatment, I think that they benefit enormously from the kind of health education that conveys to them more factual knowledge about their bodies and their minds, because the world is full of what in English is called old wives' tales. And I don't know if there's an equivalent expression in Spanish, but the myths that, yeah, and so families often perpetuate myths like this, and the kids take them in. And even very well-intentioned parents sometimes don't educate their children about their health and their bodies very effectively. Because when we get to talking about the parents of adolescents, we'll also talk about the impact on parents of the changes in their child's bodies and minds and psyches. But we'll get to that in a moment. There was somebody over there who had a question. Yeah.
¿Sí se escucha? No, creo que se da igual. ¿No? No se escucha, ¿verdad? Bueno, pues es what a pleasure to meet you. Pues voy a hablar en español, pero mejor hablando. Que justo es como mi experiencia trabajando con pacientes adolescentes es en el Hospital Español, en el psiquiátrico del Hospital Español. Y algo que yo me he dado cuenta de 10 años para acá es que antes el 80% de la población dentro de la hospitalización psiquiátrica eran personas adultas, ¿no? Arriba de los 30 años, 40 años. Ahora el 85% de la población son adolescentes. Es algo que, bueno, pues a mí me llama mucho la atención porque yo le quería preguntar desde su perspectiva, ¿qué es lo que está pasando ahora con nuestros adolescentes a nivel mundial, ¿no? Donde pareciera que estas estadísticas no solo son en México, en Estados Unidos, en Alemania, pareciera que esta incidencia de enfermedad mental en edades cada vez más tempranas pues va en aumento. Pero ¿qué será lo que está pasando como a nivel mundial que de repente estamos viendo patologías ya bastante graves en adolescentes en etapas a lo mejor mucho, muy tempranas, no en esta adolescencia, por ejemplo, temprana.
I wish I had a complete answer. But I think my experience is like yours. And I think to a certain extent, I'm going to say something quite heretical. I think psychoanalysis has to take some responsibility for sociocultural changes in adolescent self-image and in the way adolescents are perceived in the world. Because psychoanalysis really tried in the early days to help people get the idea that children's own personalities were significant, that children were people to respect, and that children were not blank slates. They were also not little wild animals to be tamed, but they were people. And so just as in psychoanalysis, the idea was to lift the repressions that were stopping people being able to understand their own impulses and their own wishes, that got generalized out to the idea of child rearing. That if you raised your child without suppressing or repressing him, then the child would not grow up to be neurotic. And this, to a certain extent, was true. And it was a very important cultural shift in, most of Europe and the Americas to treat children like people who would be listened to. But like many movements, it went very far. And so as a child and adolescent analyst, therapist, and as a teacher of analysts, one of the ways I characterize it is that at the beginning of the 20th century, children were afraid of their parents. They were afraid of being punished and felt very bad if they did something wrong. At the end of the 20th century, parents are afraid of their children, that their children will be angry with them if they set limits and say no. And if the children are angry, it means the parents are bad parents, and they're going to create pathology in their children. So that pendulum swing toward permissive child rearing was an excess of zeal. It was a good idea taken too far. Now that wasn't really what psychoanalysts ever thought, but it was the take-home message, the oversimplified message that the popular culture took up from psychoanalysis. Psychoanalytic theory of child and adolescent development always included the checks and balances of wishes and fantasies and feelings with the limits and controls of the ego and the conscience. But that got lost in translation, kind of. And so one of the things that happened especially was that I think that way of thinking affected the way people parented very little children. It also affected the way people related to adolescents. And so if the theory, the watered down, oversimplified theory, gave the impression that adolescents were supposed to be rebellious, adolescents were supposed to hate their parents because it was the only way they could individuate and become their own person, well, that then becomes a goal. Like, parents think that it should be like that. And kids think that they should hate their parents. They hide the fact that they love their parents. They're ashamed of it. I mean, think of it. You all have families and partners and spouses. If you came home from work one day and your partner or your spouse said to you, "How was your day?" And you said, "Don't bother me." Would you tolerate that? No. But people tolerate that from teenagers. People talk as if that's acceptable and expectable. There's something wrong with that picture. So I think one of the things that has happened, this is a long answer to, it is a big question, but the reason I give this long historical frame is that I think one of the things that has happened is that adults have abdicated their important role in relation to teenagers just when they most need role models of responsible adults who take pleasure in functioning realistically. We have abdicated and left them only influenced by their peers who are struggling with the same things and don't have much to offer except groupthink, all premised on the same conflict between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. So I think the shift in the psychiatric population relates also to that we haven't given adolescents tools to use to deal with what is potentially overwhelming experiences from inside and outside. Then when we add in other influences, like the fact that I think it's been 10 years since I've seen an adolescent boy come for an evaluation who has not been looking at porn on the computer from when he was 9 or 10. So instead of offering a healthy, limited, graded introduction to sexuality and to adult sexuality, quite young children without mental and psychological and emotional equipment are flooded with unmanageable stimulation. It renders them helpless. So what do? They say, okay, I'm going to make this real, and then it won't be so scary. And so then they want to interact with people in a way that is certainly antisocial, usually misogynistic, and that may be a different conversation that, well, I'm not going there now. But I think if we look at the population, the shifts in the psychiatric population and the shifts in the kinds of disorders, it gets us back to your question about psychosomatic and body things. You know, the number of anorexic or bulimic or self-cutting or drug addiction or substance abuse in adolescence has just really gone up. And I think that that is something that as adults we have to really think about. How can we, and this is where it's great that there are school people here, because I think psychoanalysts have to find ways to work together with school counselors and school teachers and with the, I don't know, like the Ministry of Education, the curriculum designers, to think about what kind of framework, what kind of scaffolding are we offering to teenagers to make it possible for them to not be overwhelmed, not reach for magical solutions, because substance abuse is a magical solution. It'll regulate your feelings without you having to do any work at all. It'll also destroy you. Self-destructive body interactions like self-cutting, suicide, promiscuity, pregnancy, these things all have the same psychological profile. And so I think that's my little my big explanation of what I think is going on there.
Terrible, que es la agresión. Los adolescentes viven con miedo. el adolescente tiene pocas oportunidades, por ejemplo, en la parte laboral. El adolescente está viviendo situaciones que difícilmente vivíamos anteriormente, como es la separación de familias obligada, como son los migrantes. En junio del año pasado tuve la oportunidad de ir a trabajar al estado de Guanajuato con maestros rurales. Yo hablaba sobre trastornos de aprendizaje, sobre trastorno por déficit de atención, cuando de repente ellos me empezaron a comentar de que sus adolescentes vivían porque mataban a sus familias y porque ellos también estaban en riesgo de morir, y que muchos de ellos debían llevar a la escuela armas para defenderse, y que había de hecho también sicarios a los cuales ellos debían entregarles el dinero o lo que ganaran en actividades ilícitas. Eso hoy por hoy es lo que están viviendo nuestros adolescentes. Y muchos adolescentes también, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos y en otros países, que se embarazan para que sus hijos tengan esa nacionalidad y no regresen a su país porque tienen miedo de regresar. Entonces, todo ese miedo, por supuesto que ha afectado el desarrollo adolescente normal, porque no puede ser lo mismo vivir con esta violencia, vivir con tanto miedo, con tanto terror, simple y sencillamente miedo a tu vida, a que si mañana vas a estar bien.
Wow. Yes. I think there too, though, we should consider the obligation of adults to create safety. When we think either about child upbringing or about clinical work, the paramount value is the provision of safety. Without a safe space, you cannot do therapy and you cannot have healthy development. And the space has to be safe for the child to experience his own thoughts and feelings, but it also has to be safe to experiment within a more limited range. And I think that given that 50% of the world's population within the next few years is going to be under 25.
Hay interferencia, es que hay una interferencia. ¿Sí? A ver si no me pueden dar el audio.
Sí. A ver.
Should I go ahead?
¿Soy yo? Sí, sí.
Okay. Within the next few years, 50% of the world's population will be under 25. We have to make sure that they're not growing up in terror and anxiety. Because what I was talking about at the beginning of the afternoon is the way in which when the quotient of anxiety or terror hits a threshold of being overwhelming, people respond as best they can. They fight back, and they fight back with aggression, and they fight back with magical thinking. And when their own personal aggression doesn't do the job, then they reach for weapons. And I imagine it's difficult in Mexico. Coming from the United States, the issue of weapons is, I'll call it crazy. That's a very scientific term, speaking as an analyst. The issue of weapons in the United States is crazy. But it comes out of exactly this fear that people think the only way to be safe is to have more weapons.
Las personas se sienten seguras, dicen que se sienten más seguras y la única forma de sentirse seguras es teniendo armas.
Okay. I think that there too, it's the way in which adolescents function. Like a tuning fork or a barometer of a society. Just as infant mortality is a very important measure of a society's health, I think one of the other measures
is what is going on with adolescence. And so the other piece of this is that it's very overwhelming for all of us. Because the scale of the problem, the areas of society that it reaches into are beyond our skills and our power. So I think one of the things that would be nice if we could take away together from today's discussion is to be realistic and not be discouraged by the reality about what we do have to offer. What power do we have to make a difference for the adolescents who are struggling so much? So one of the things that might be interesting to share is some of the experiences that we have had where we felt it was effective to intervene with adolescents. For instance, in the 1960s in London, a group of psychoanalysts started the Brent Consultation Center. It was a walk-in center in a section of London that was quite poor and quite violent, and I don't know how to say it, the borough government, the government of that piece of the city. Yeah. Supported financially this endeavor, which involved having a center that was open 3 nights a week from 4 o'clock in the afternoon till 10 o'clock at night. And it was staffed by psychoanalysts, and adolescents could walk in. And they would be able to talk to an analyst, and they could come back the next week for several weeks. While an intervention could be designed that would meet their particular need. Whether it was to offer low fee or free psychoanalysis, which is a long analytic tradition, or to have a group therapy, or to help them get a tutor at school. We functioned in a sense as a triage. Mm. I bring this experience because Brent is now 50 years old and still functioning and still now is known among the teenagers in that part of London as a place where you can go and somebody will listen to you and take you seriously. And that sounds simple, but if we think of the adolescents we know, I think this is one of the most important things we can do for adolescents is truly listen to them. And that may get us into the topic of helping the parents of adolescents. And I would love to talk about that because I really enjoy working with parents of people of all ages. So maybe before we continue with other people's things, I'll say a few words about parents of adolescents and the way in which parents of adolescents are challenged in their own identities and their own development in middle adulthood. Think of what it means to a parent to have the child turn into a sexual person. Parents know how to relate to other adults who are sexual. But they're not sure what to do with their little child who has turned into this new kind of person. Also, think of how beautiful young adolescents are. Just at the time when parents in their own bodies, it's changing. They may not be quite as energetic as before.
A lo mejor ya no son tan energéticos como antes.
They might not feel quite so sexual as before.
Y tampoco tienen tanto deseo sexual como antes.
The adolescent is so beautiful and smooth, and the parents
la piel
are
del
beginning to get
adolescente
wrinkles.
es tan
This is a big challenge to the parent's self-esteem. And what do we all do when our self-esteem is threatened? We try to say how marvelous we are, how we know everything. But if you're busy being the expert on everything, you're not listening to what your adolescent is beginning to learn. It's a serious problem. Yes, it's that if you are defensively, self-protectively, to deal with your own vanity, your own, then one of the ways you might do it is to keep control and keep knowledge about everything in your hands. It's very hard to share the authority So one of the important things to help the parents of adolescents do
Entonces, una de las cosas para ayudarlos y hacer que los padres puedan hacer algo al respecto
is to be sure that they have other sources of self-esteem for themselves
que tengan otras fuentes, otras fuerzas para de autoestima para ellos.
that instead of being the boss of their child
Pero en vez de ser el jefe
in order to feel good,
para sentirse valioso,
that they have to have a healthy life beyond their parenting.
pues deben de tener una vida fuerte y saludable en frente de sus hijos.
Más allá de ser papás.
Más allá.
Más allá de ser padres.
So that's one thing that is important for the parents of adolescents.
Esa es una de las cosas importantes de para los padres de los adolescentes.
Another thing is to be curious about what their children are learning and becoming.
Y otra cosa es tener curiosidad de lo que están aprendiendo y dándose cuenta sus jóvenes.
To take pleasure in really listening.
Realmente tener placer en realmente escuchar.
So an example would be that
Un ejemplo sería
helping parents not automatically say no immediately.
ayudar a los padres a que no automáticamente digan no,
Because if they stop and listen
porque se detienen ahí
to
y escuchan
the adolescent's reasons for asking to do something
a las razones que tiene el adolescente para hacer algo
or suggesting some family decision,
o sugerir sobre alguna decisión familiar,
then they are demonstrating respect.
entonces están demostrando respeto.
And if you demonstrate respect to somebody, you're much more likely to get respect back.
Y si demuestran respeto por alguien, es muy probable que también te den respeto.
The more authoritarian we are with adolescents,
Mientras más autoritarios seamos con nuestros adolescentes,
the more understandably they will be rebellious.
es más entendible que estén rebeldes con nosotros.
But if we take them seriously and respect that they may have a really good idea that we didn't think of,
Y les decimos que tienen una idea maravillosa que no se nos había ocurrido,
then the relationship will start to transform.
entonces la relación empezará a transformarse.
And that's our goal with adolescents, is to transform the relationship
Con los adolescentes, que transformen sus relaciones,
so that the adolescent and the parents become resources for each other,
para que los adolescentes y padres sean recursos que puedan utilizar mutuamente
for the rest of their lives.
para el resto de sus vidas.
That, I think, is true of adolescents who are developing relatively well,
Eso es cierto para todos los jóvenes que se están desarrollando relativamente bien.
it's also very important in therapeutic work with adolescents who are not doing so well.
Y también es muy importante para el trabajo terapéutico con adolescentes que no les está yendo tan bien.
I don't think we can effectively treat adolescents unless we also offer some work for their parents to change.
Creo que no podríamos tratar efectivamente a los adolescentes si no les ofrecemos a los padres algo más para cambiar.
So this is something for us to talk about in relation to therapeutic work, but I also think it's an interesting idea in the school context.
También es bueno traer estos temas de nuestro trabajo terapéutico, pero también es importante ponerlo y manifestarlo en el contexto de la escuela.
Because I think of a school as a potential community center.
Porque pienso en la escuela como un centro de la comunidad.
So that to consider whether parents of adolescents who are being challenged by their child's development might find a resource in the community that isn't only therapeutic,
Para que los padres y adolescentes que están luchando por usarse como recursos mutuos, vean que en la comunidad no hay solamente algo terapéutico, sino algo más.
that doesn't rise to the level of needing a therapeutic intervention, but to think in
Llega al nivel de lo terapéutico, sino es como además o en lugar de lo terapéutico, ¿no? El propio contexto escolar como un refuerzo antes de lo terapéutico.
a zone that is intermediate.
Exacto, intermedio. Exactamente.
Yeah, that has to do with supporting development and transformation and might have a preventive impact. Mhm. But we also ask too much of teachers. There has been a real social change as both parents work more now. We're also expecting teachers to bring up our children. And so finding that balance, I think, is tremendously important. Something like that. Mhm.
De poder estar en cualquier lado en comunicación con quien sea, y creo que es un elemento muy importante.
Sí.
Tenía yo un niño en terapia, bueno, en psicoanálisis, en análisis, que tenía 13 años, ¿no? Y no sabíamos cuál era el motivo de su angustia, una angustia que rebasaba un nivel intolerable en la escuela, en la casa, hasta que llegó y me pidió, porque además no tenía, como los adolescentes hoy día suelen no tener lenguaje, manera de hablar. Llegó y me pidió mi iPad para mostrarme los juegos que jugaba. Y eran impresionantes. Cómo cortaba la cabeza de animales, de personas, y cómo al tener castigada el iPad lo podía hacer en la noche debajo de sus sábanas y nadie se había dado cuenta. Entonces yo creo que es importante la vigilancia y los límites que, bueno, ni los padres ni los adolescentes pueden tener en la falta de límites, incluso en el adulto, que es el padre, compite en la belleza con tantos implementos que hay de cirugías y de cómo el padre se viste como adolescente. O sea, no hay diferenciación. Se promueve lo que decía la separación, pero no la diferenciación. es un tema largo, pero creo que es importante considerarlo.
You have given us several topics to consider,
Nos has dado muchos temas a considerar
and they are all important,
y todos son importantes.
not in a particular order of response.
Sin ningún orden en particular para responder cada tema.
But I think what you're saying
Pero
touches
creo
on
que
some
lo que
of
están
the
diciendo
themes
toca varios de los temas que voy a hablar.
that I am very surprised when I work with parents
Yo me sorprendo mucho cuando trabajo con padres
that they don't know that there are parental controls possible on the computer.
ellos no saben que son controles parentales dentro de sus propios computadores.
Where have they been living?
¿Dónde han estado viviendo? Entonces,
It speaks to the point you're making about the difficulty for the grown-ups.
entonces es algo del punto de la dificultad de relacionarnos incluso con los adultos.
That there is a collusion
Hay
with
una
the adults
relación
with the children.
entre los adultos y los niños.
Because it's hard for the adults to accept
Porque es difícil para los adultos aceptar la frustración
of being an adult, being
de ser
middle-aged.
un adulto de edad media. Bien,
We also have a paradox to deal with
ahí tenemos que lidiar con una paradoja.
because rock and roll was supposed to destroy society.
Porque se supone que el rock and roll destruye la sociedad.
And television was you get my point.
Y televisión también, bueno, creo que me entienden.
So now we all think video games are going to destroy
Entonces ahora pensamos los videojuegos van a destruir la sociedad.
but
Pero
video games can become addictive.
los videojuegos pueden convertirse en una adicción.
And that is a different issue.
Y ese es un tema completamente aparte.
It's not necessarily the video games or the tablets.
No es necesariamente los videojuegos o tabletas,
It's the addiction.
es la adicción.
And so
Y por
we
lo
have to
tanto,
approach this
tenemos que abordar esto.
not by outlawing rock and roll or outlawing tablets.
Sin bajar el volumen al rock and roll o sin volviendo ilegal las artes.
But really to think what is the psychological use being made
Sino pensar realmente cuál es el uso psicológico que se le da
of the particular thing.
de estas cosas en particular.
And again, I come back to the responsibility of adults.
Y ahí vengo a la retorno a la respuesta de los adultos.
For instance, the game Fortnite.
Por ejemplo, el juego de Fortnite.
Adults think because the characters look like cartoons,
Bueno, los padres piensan, los adultos piensan que como los personajes se ven como de caricatura,
that this is okay for young children.
que eso está bien para los jóvenes.
But what those cartoon characters are doing is assassination.
Pero lo que están haciendo en personajes tipo caricaturas son asesinatos y vandalismo.
So it's not cute.
Entonces no es nada lindo.
So these are ways in which
Entonces estas son formas en que
if we don't exercise judgment
si no tenemos juicio,
and explain the basis for our judgment to
si
young people,
explicamos la base que tiene nuestro juicio, nuestro razonamiento para los jóvenes,
how can they internalize methodology?
entonces no van a entonces cómo van a interiorizar.
Yeah, how can they internalize methodology? Should we stop with the mic? Should we just talk?
Yes.
Yes.
Ya apáguenlo, joven.
For making good judgments.
Para hacer buenos juicios.
People aren't born knowing how to make judgments.
Las personas nacen ya sabiendo cómo hacer juicios.
They have to be taught.
No saben cómo hacer juicios, tienen que ser educados a hacer.
But if we function in a society where we want the grown-ups
Pero si funcionamos en una sociedad donde queremos que los adultos
to be authoritarian
sean
with children,
autoritarios con los niños,
part of that attitude
Parte de esa actitud
is you don't explain the reason for
Será.
your prohibitions or permissions.
porque no explicamos la base de nuestras prohibiciones o
Autorización.
permisos. Ya, o permisos.
They're just supposed to obey.
Entonces, se supone que solamente van a obedecernos.
And it's arbitrary.
Y eso es arbitrario.
Eso es
Arbitrario.
So the result of that style of interaction
Y el resultado entonces de ese estilo de interacción
is that teenagers go underground.
es que los jóvenes van debajo de la tierra.
Se vuelven
Como hacen el
subterráneos.
subterráneos.
Yeah, they start keeping secrets from the grown-ups.
Ah, sí, se van como debajo de lo subterráneo y empiezan a mantener secretos hacia los adultos.
So if it's better for people to have a private life, fair enough. That's part of the separateness of each person, that they have a private life.
La importancia para que las personas tengan vida privada, esa es parte importante de lo que es la separabilidad.
Yeah.
Whereas secrets
Are part of a power relationship, donde los secretos son parte de una relación de poder.
Mientras que los secretos son parte de una relación de poder.
So when we do authoritarian parenting or authoritarian teaching, entonces cuando hacemos un parenting,
Sí, parentalidad,
Parentalidad.
autoritativa o
Autoritaria.
not
autoritarios.
authoritative, authoritarian.
Sí, autoritarios.
Yeah, yeah. Then we are setting it up that the children will be
Entonces estamos estableciendo de que los niños van a ser guardar secretos.
Whereas if we respect them enough to explain the basis on which we make
En cambio,
decisions,
si les explicamos las bases de por qué tomamos una decisión,
we're also teaching them to explain to us the
así
basis for their decisions.
les estamos también enseñando que ellos nos expliquen las bases de sus decisiones.
I'm a dermatologist, so maybe this will be very easy for all of you. But it is not a
Más despacito para que
Sí,
lo
la
puedan
Dermatóloga, y a lo mejor esto suena muy fácil para todos
but it
ustedes.
is not normal for adolescents to have secrets. It
¿Por
is
qué no
not
es
part
normal
of
para
being
los
an adolescent.
adolescentes tener secretos? ¿No es parte de su desarrollo para ser adultos?
No, I make a real distinction between privacy and secrecy.
No, hice una verdadera separación entre privacidad y guardar secretos.
Everyone has a right to
Todo el mundo
privacy,
tiene derecho a la privacidad.
and it's a given of mental life. You can't read my mind.
Y
I have a
para
private mind.
tener una vida mental, una vida privada, tú no puedes leerme.
It's only if I choose to share it with you.
But secrecy is a power relationship. Think of it. I know something you don't know. Nya, 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 nya. This is a power relationship. So, one of the things that is an ingredient of respect between people is to trust that if you don't threaten a teenager, they will increasingly want to share their private inner life with you. And this happens in any relationship of trust. In a therapeutic relationship, as the relationship grows and deepens, and it is safe by virtue of being dependable, eventually the young person feels safe enough to share themselves willingly. And that can happen with a teacher. I think we have all had some, at least one teacher in our lives where we felt that kind of potential bond. And I'm interested that you're a dermatologist because adolescents struggle so much with their skin. It brings in so many aspects of their self-esteem and their development. So in this specialty, you have a particular contact with the self-image and the self-esteem of the adolescent. So for you to give an adolescent permission for their feelings of shame, just as a therapist does, this is part of creating a safe relationship and a safe space. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When a 4-year-old first realizes that they can lie, this is a developmental achievement. It first represents the realization that I have a private mental life, that my parents don't know if I don't tell them. Now, we then have to teach them the morality. But first, we have to recognize what a developmental step it is. Mm-hmm. But then, when we go through the next stages of development, we see that lying takes on many different functions. But most of them are self-protective. And if we think of adolescents as very vulnerable in their self-esteem, then to lie or brag or show off is a way of boosting their self-esteem sometimes. The remedy for that, I think, is to support adolescents in authentic sources of self-esteem. And to do that, they have to have resources from adults, from school, from youth clubs, from all the social provisions, so that their self-esteem is not based on illusions or lies. So it's a kind of interesting parallel with their parents. They have the same predicament in a way. The parents have to find authentic sources of self-esteem in their new stage of development. Just like the adolescents have to. And not based on having the right kind of sneaker. So I think when adolescents, when an adolescent lies, I think our first question should be, what made them feel vulnerable? That they had to protect themselves in this maladaptive way. And it's a real demand on the grown-ups, not to jump to the morality. The morality is important and has to be addressed. But first, I want to know what triggered the lie. What was the adolescent trying to solve? So I think there too, raising the consciousness of adults. Of the meaning of behavior. This is a basic psychoanalytic axiom. That behavior has meaning. It's always about something. And it always serves some psychological function. It's doing something for the adolescent. So that's another way to think about it, is what was the trigger? What were they trying to solve? And what made them think that this was a good solution? Because the next step, either therapeutically or pedagogically, is to generate an alternative solution that is more adaptive, more constructive, and builds, is growth promoting. This is what in the two systems model we call an open system solution. Abierto. As opposed to a closed system solution which goes nowhere. It's a static negative feedback loop. And we can help adolescents see how this works when we can show them the sequence that the lie, for instance, made it worse instead of better. That they have to compound the problem instead of opt for an alternative solution. But the demand on all of us as grown-ups, whether it's therapists or parents or teachers, is to take the time to do that and not jump to a premature solution in order to deal with our own anger or our own anxiety. Because it's annoying to us. It's also worrying to us if we see a teenager doing something maladaptive. So this is, I think, part of why the day-to-day interactions offer us many, many opportunities to shift the course of the development. Yeah, the pathway of the development has to be put back in the right direction. And that takes work and it takes time. You know, 6 sessions of CBT are not going to change it. And medication may relieve stress, but it doesn't teach a person anything. So we're really on a road of building understanding, generating new tools in the mind, new ways of self-regulating, so that the adolescent can keep himself safe and take risks that are manageable. They need to experiment, but we have to make sure that they know how to protect themselves too. And they can only learn that by taking in our active protective function. Anybody else? This is a very important dimension. And as I hear what you're saying, I connect it to what we were talking about in terms of authoritarian attitudes. Because it's a very short distance from authoritarian attitudes to an idea of perfection. This is an impossible standard. If we want adolescents to have a healthy self-esteem, that has to include the fact that they're not perfect. But if we present ourselves as perfect, that becomes the ideal, and it's completely unrealistic. So they will always feel like failures. I am a baseball fan, and I am fond of pointing out to people that in baseball, you will go to the Hall of Fame if you bat 300. That means 3 out of 10. This is the pinnacle in the sport. Not 10 out of 10. So the idea that we have to have a strong enough self-esteem as adults to not be ashamed of our adolescents seeing our mistakes. One of the major developmental tasks of late adolescence is to come to terms with the reality of themselves and their parents. To set aside idealization. And to appreciate one's parents, their good qualities and their bad qualities. Because one of the differences between childhood and adolescence is that in childhood, the menu that is offered by parents is kind of like a prefix, like a set meal. you have to take the whole meal. In adolescence, the menu is a la carte. You can select what to like from your parents. Yes. And so the reality is that our parents are not uniformly wonderful. We can love them anyway, but we don't have to completely identify with them. We can make selective identifications. But adolescents can only do that if we are strong enough and comfortable enough. That we like ourselves well enough, even with our faults.
Divorce puts the greatest burden on the children.
And it's very painful to think of the children like little gypsies going back and forth. You know, with their little backpacks from one house to the other. And for me, the most painful thing is when parents say, I get the child for this week. Because the child is being, I'll use the word exploited, in the service of the battle between the parents that is continuing. And part of the demand is that the child has to adjust. I mean, think if you were asked to be in a different company one week and a different corporation the next week, a different job. I mean, it would make you crazy. So the strain and demand and stress, I think that's another ingredient in the shift of psychiatric illness in children and adolescents. In the United States, the divorce rate is now decreasing. But I think in countries where there has been a religious prohibition, that is now less, the rate is going up. So that, is that true here? Yeah. And I think it is a challenge to our society. Many, many years ago, Anna Freud wrote a series of books with a law professor from Yale Law School, precisely about custody and divorce and guardianship. And it was called In the Best Interests of the Child. And it became the legal standard for divorce decisions. In the past, the interests of the child were not taken into account at all. Just as it was Anna Freud's work that allowed parents to visit children in the hospital. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's on paper.
Mucho más complicada.
Well, that's the trouble. That's the trouble because it sounds good, but it is not adequately
informed in the legal system by the kind of real knowledge that is in this room about what is really happening. And so that is another challenge to us, that we have to show them in the legal system what is at stake for these children. And that maybe the best disposition will not be popular with parents. And this was one of the troubles with Anna Freud's book, that some of the conclusions, some of the advice was not equal between parents. It advised that children need to live one place as a primary residence. But then it's not fair to the grown-ups. This is a hard choice. And people want stuff to be easy. For me, a hallmark of psychoanalytic thinking is that we refuse to deny the complexity. That we say we have to encompass it. And think about the real complexity of every individual and the complexity of what we have to offer. So I think we have a lot of work to do. And I think part of what you're doing to do that work is to come here today. That we keep learning, we keep thinking, we keep supporting each other. Because it's very, very hard to do this kind of work without each other. So I really appreciate what I have learned from you today. And I hope that I have been able to offer you some things to think about. Thank you.
Bueno, pues queremos agradecer haber tenido la presencia de esta dama, que además, sintiéndose mal, estuvo aquí con nosotros todo este tiempo. Y en nombre de Ampiep, queremos hacerle entrega de esta constancia. También queremos agradecer nuevamente su presencia a los amigos de y a las personas nuevas.